The candles were still burning when they found him. That was the thing that stayed with her. Not the silence that had settled over the long table. Not the overturned crystal glass, port, dark as a wound, spreading slowly across the white linen. Not the expressions on the 7 faces that remained. That peculiar, suspended look people wear when the mind has received news it has not yet decided what to do with. The candles, still burning, as though the evening had simply continued without him. Mrs. Hilda Fenwick set down her spoon, looked at the man slumped in the chair at the head of the table, and said, in the voice she normally reserved for misbehaving grandchildren, "Well, someone had better telephone the inspector." No one moved. "My name is Andrew, and you are listening to Quiet Mysteries Tales, where every week we gather in the warmth for something to puzzle over, something to unravel, something that ends as all good things do, with the truth laid quietly on the table, like a card no one expected." Tonight's story is called A Gentleman's Death at the Harvest Supper. 7 suspects, 1 table, and a woman who notices everything and says just enough. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now then, let us begin at the beginning, which is to say, at the end. Chapter 1. The Guests of Thornfield House. Thornfield House was not, in any strict architectural sense, a beautiful building. It had been added to too many times by too many owners with too many opinions, and the result was a structure of considerable personality and absolutely no coherence. A Georgian front door, Victorian bay windows, and somewhere at the back, a conservatory that had been described by its builder in 1912 as temporary, and had thereafter outlasted 3 marriages and a war. But in the last days of October, when the kitchen garden had given everything it had and the hedgerows were the color of old copper, and the Reverend Ashworth had been persuaded once again to lend his good name to the annual harvest supper, Thornfield House became, briefly, reliably, brilliantly, the finest table in the county. Mrs. Cecilia Drummond had kept the tradition for 31 years. She had started it when her husband Arthur was still alive, when the guest list had been manageable and the conversation had run to crops and church roofing funds and the mild scandals of neighboring parishes. Since Arthur's death 8 years ago, the table had grown longer and the conversation considerably more interesting. This year's guests, as Mrs. Fenwick, who had been invited for 22 consecutive years and had therefore earned certain observations, had noted when she arrived, were as follows. Dr. Phineas Brooke, 64, the village physician, a widower of some years' standing, and a man who gave the impression of having once had a fine sense of humor and carefully put it away somewhere safe. He sat at Mrs. Drummond's left with the composed attentiveness of someone who has learned to find most social situations professionally instructive. Miss Lavinia Carr, 58, who taught English literature at the grammar school in Much Hadley, and wore the expression of someone who has spent 40 years reading about the worst of human nature and found reality consistently lacking in imagination. Mr. Oliver Pace, 52, who owned the larger of the 2 farms on the Kelmscott Road, and who Mrs. Fenwick had always privately felt was a man who kept a great many ledgers very neatly, and a great many feelings somewhat less so. His wife, Mrs. Patricia Pace, 49, who was pleasant, quiet, and very attentive to the wine. Mr. Gerald Stowe, 67, who had retired from some sort of London finance and moved to the village 6 years ago and had since applied himself with considerable energy to the project of belonging to it. He had joined 4 committees, organized 2 fundraisers, and been described by every person Mrs. Fenwick had spoken to as tremendously good value, without any of them being able to produce a specific example of the value in question. And finally, the man at the head of the table, Mr. Marcus Alderton, 71, Thornfield House's nearest neighbor, and, until approximately 22 minutes into the second course, its most distinguished guest. Mrs. Fenwick watched him across the soup. He was a man she had known for 30 years, and had never entirely trusted for reasons she had not until this evening been able to articulate. He had the face of a man accustomed to having things arranged in his favor, and the particular kind of charm that functions as a means rather than an expression. She had always thought, watching him work a room, that his warmth had a direction to it. It flowed toward people who were useful and away from people who were not, as reliably as water finding its level. Tonight, the warmth was not flowing at all. He was, she observed, watching Mr. Stowe, and Mr. Stowe was watching his soup. Chapter 2. It was Lavinia Carr who noticed first, though she said nothing, which Mrs. Fenwick felt was characteristic. Marcus Alderton put down his wine glass. The port, poured by Mrs. Drummond herself from the decanter that had sat at the center of the table since the first course, and made a sound that was not quite speech and not quite silence, a sound that the room registered before any individual in it had consciously heard it. Then he leaned forward, slightly. Then he was still. Mrs. Drummond said his name, once, in the tone of a woman asking a question she was afraid had already been answered. Dr. Brooke was at his side in moments, with the quiet efficiency of a man who has learned to move quickly without appearing to. He checked, assessed, and then straightened, and the expression he arranged on his face for the benefit of the table was careful and composed, which told Mrs. Fenwick considerably more than if he had simply said what she already knew. "I think," said Dr. Brooke, "that we should telephone Inspector Crane." Gerald Stowe reached for his wine glass, and then thought better of it. Patricia Pace looked at her husband. Oliver Pace looked at the decanter. And Mrs. Hilda Fenwick, who was 73 years old, had buried a husband, raised 3 children, sat on the parish council for 19 years, and read every mystery novel published in the English language since 1946, opened her evening bag, took out a small notebook and a pencil, and began to write. Chapter 3. Now, before we go any further, who do you suspect? There are 6 people at that table, and one of them is lying. Drop your guess in the comments. We'll find out together before the end. Mrs. Fenwick had a system, which she had never explained to anyone, and which she felt no pressing need to begin explaining now. It was not, strictly speaking, a detective system. She was not a detective. She was a retired headmistress with good eyes and a very long memory for the way people behaved when they were frightened. Frightened people, in her experience, fell into 2 categories. The first category became very loud. They asked questions, suggested explanations, made themselves conspicuous in their cooperation. They were performing, consciously or not, the part of innocent bystander, and the performance was sometimes very good, but it was always a performance. The second category became very still. They turned inward, reassembled themselves quietly, and waited. Gerald Stowe was in the first category. He had already suggested 3 explanations for Marcus Alderton's collapse: a heart condition, the port, the shellfish at the starter, with the helpful urgency of a man trying to ensure that at least one of his suggestions was adopted. Oliver Pace was in the second. He had not spoken since Dr. Brooke made his announcement. He was looking at his hands, which were folded on the table with the careful deliberateness of a man controlling something. Mrs. Drummond was in neither category, which Mrs. Fenwick found interesting. She was moving. She was practical, clearing, attending, organizing, with the focused calm of a woman who has had a very great shock and dealt with it by becoming useful. Mrs. Fenwick had known women like that. She had been one, once. Lavinia Carr was reading. Mrs. Fenwick noted this with the attention it deserved. In the 15 minutes since Marcus Alderton had died at her dinner table, Lavinia Carr had taken a small paperback from her handbag and was reading it with perfect composure. She was not, Mrs. Fenwick felt, reading because she was indifferent. She was reading because she was thinking, and thinking was a thing she apparently preferred to do behind a prop. The book, Mrs. Fenwick observed, was being held upside down. She made a note. Chapter 4. Inspector Thomas Crane was a compact, precise man of 45 who had been born 3 villages away, which meant he understood, in the particular way that outsiders never quite manage, the architecture of a village's loyalties. He knew that the silence of small communities was not hostility but self-protection, and that the way into it was patience rather than pressure. He arrived in 40 minutes, examined the table, conferred with Dr. Brooke in the hall, and then came into the sitting room where the guests had been quietly relocated and sat down across from Mrs. Fenwick with the expression of a man who has been told something and wants to verify it. "Mrs. Drummond says you were watching the table throughout the meal." "I generally am," said Mrs. Fenwick. "Old habit. And did you notice anything unusual before Mr. Alderton collapsed?" She had noticed three things. The first was that Gerald Stowe had leaned across the table at some point during the main course and exchanged a brief, quiet exchange with Mr. Alderton that had ended with Alderton's expression shifting from controlled pleasantness to something that was not quite anger and not quite contempt, the expression of a man who has heard a threat and found it, not credible, but inconvenient. The second was that Oliver Pace, shortly after the port was poured, had stood to refill his own glass and, in doing so, had been very close indeed to the decanter for approximately 6 seconds before sitting down again. She could not say she had seen him do anything with the decanter. She could say she had not seen him not do anything. The third was this. When Mrs. Drummond had poured Marcus Alderton's port, Lavinia Carr had watched. Not the pouring, the glass. And specifically the glass as it moved from the center of the table to the place in front of Alderton. Her expression, for the 2 seconds before she picked up her book, had been one that Mrs. Fenwick recognized from her years in the classroom. It was the expression of a student who has seen the answer to a question they did not set. "Three things," said Mrs. Fenwick, and began to explain. Chapter 5. The search of Marcus Alderton's house was, Inspector Crane told Mrs. Fenwick the following morning over tea in her kitchen, illuminating. Among the papers in his study desk, a desk that had been locked, and which had not been difficult to open once they had thought to look for the key in the lining of his winter coat, were the following items. Copies of correspondence between Alderton and a London firm of solicitors regarding a property transaction on the Kelmscott Road. The transaction involved the purchase of land from Oliver Pace's farm under terms that, the inspector allowed carefully, were not obviously voluntary. A letter, and signed, which described in fairly precise terms certain financial arrangements between Alderton and Gerald Stowe that would have been of significant interest to regulatory bodies had they become known, and a receipt, 6 months old, from a dispensary in Hadley, for a compound that the pathologist had that morning confirmed as the substance responsible for Marcus Alderton's death. The receipt was made out in the name of Lavinia Carr. Mrs. Fenwick set down her teacup. "She purchased it," said Crane, "though she states she did so at his request, for his garden. He apparently had a problem with burrowing animals. And does she expect that to be believed? She expects it to be considered. She's precise in her answers. She teaches English literature," said Mrs. Fenwick. "She has spent 40 years with Wilkie Collins and Agatha Christie. She knows how evidence is supposed to appear." There was a pause. "She also," said Mrs. Fenwick, "was holding her book upside down." Chapter 6. The truth, as it emerged over the following 3 days, was not simple. Truths rarely are in cases where several people have several reasons, and only one of them is acted. Marcus Alderton had spent 30 years being a man who used information the way other people used money, as leverage, as currency, as power. Oliver Pace had been paying for his silence regarding a matter that had begun as a business dispute and had long since become something that looked rather more like coercion. Gerald Stowe had been, for 6 years, in an arrangement that benefited Alderton considerably more than it benefited Stowe, and which Stowe had come increasingly to understand he could not safely exit. And Lavinia Carr had known about all of it. She had known because she had been, for a period of 4 years in the early part of their acquaintance, something more than Marcus Alderton's neighbor. And because when that had ended, as it had ended, she told the inspector, with the particular conclusiveness of someone disposing of a habit they've grown tired of, He had made very certain she could not speak freely about what she knew. She had purchased the compound, she maintained, at his request. She had placed it, she did not deny, near the decanter before dinner. Whether she had expected him to use it on himself, or whether she had expected someone else to take the opportunity she had arranged, that, Inspector Crane told Mrs. Fenwick, was a question her solicitor had advised her not to answer. And the others? Said Mrs. Fenwick. Stowe almost certainly knew. Pace. We believe he had an intention that he ultimately did not act on. The compound in the decanter was introduced before he touched it. So she did it herself. The evidence suggests so, though she has not admitted it. Mrs. Fenwick was quiet for a moment, looking at the autumn garden through the window. She watched him for 30 years, she said at last. Do you know, I think the cruelest thing about a man like that is not what he does to the people who oppose him. It's what he does to the people who can see exactly what he is, and have no means to say so. She refilled her teacup. I hope she finds a good solicitor. And so the candles at Thornfield House went out at last. 7 guests, 1 table, and a truth that had been waiting, rather longer than was comfortable, to be found. If you guessed correctly, leave it in the comments. We want to hear from you. And if you'd like to come back next week for another quiet evening in very suspicious company, there is a new story waiting. A locked room, a missing letter, and a village that has been keeping a secret since 1962. We will see you then. Good evening. Do keep your eyes open.